There's a stretch of the Washington coast where the math doesn't work. If you're standing in Westport when the Cascadia Subduction Zone finally moves, the shaking runs for several minutes. When it stops, you have somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes before the first wave arrives. That's your entire window, 10 to 15 minutes. Washington's emergency management division has measured how long it actually takes to walk out of the inundation zone from parts of the outer coast. And in many of those areas, the answer is an hour or more on foot, over ground that just shook for 5 minutes, with liquefied soil underfoot, bridges possibly gone, and everyone around you trying to do the exact same thing at the exact same moment. An hour of walking against 15 minutes of time. That gap has already been measured and published, county by county. The state has also worked out roughly how many buildings it would take to close that gap and where they'd need to stand. The number is somewhere between 58 and more than 80. Only 2 of them exist. Today, I want to walk you through the strangest hazard policy story on the West Coast, which is that 2 neighboring states facing the exact same fault and the exact same wave have spent the last decade moving in completely opposite directions. One state is building towers. The other repealed the law that kept schools and hospitals out of the flood zone in the first place. So let's start with why vertical evacuation exists as a concept at all, because the whole idea rests on one uncomfortable fact about the Cascadia coast. In a distant tsunami, one generated by an earthquake in Alaska or Japan, you'd get hours of warning, and a car would genuinely be useful. But in a local Cascadia event, the earthquake and the tsunami are the same event. There's no warning to issue because the ground shaking beneath you is the warning. And a lot of the Washington outer coast is a low sand spit, surrounded on 3 sides by water, with the nearest natural high ground several miles inland, across bridges that may not survive the shaking. So if you can't get people out horizontally in time, the only remaining option is to get them up. There's a second piece of this that locals on the coast are taught and that visitors almost never hear. In a local Cascadia event, no official message will reach you before the water does. The alert systems that exist are built for distant sources, where a buoy detects a wave out in the open ocean, and there's time to push a message out to people on shore. When the fault yun, dare your own feet is the source, the shaking itself is the alert. Strong shaking on the Washington or Oregon coast, or a shaking that goes on for longer than about 20 seconds, means you move immediately on foot toward high ground or a designated structure, without waiting for a siren, a phone alert, or anyone's permission to do it. It's too late if you wait for confirmation. The confirmation is the water arriving. Back in 2010 and 2011, the University of Washington and the state's Emergency Management Division ran a project called Safe Haven, funded through the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program. They worked with 3 focused coastal communities and looked at 4 different ways of building height into a flat landscape. Towers, which are freestanding platforms with stairs or ramps. Berms, he essentially engineered hills, artificial high ground built from scratch, combinations of those 2 approaches. And ordinary buildings designed with a survivable roof on top, so that a school, a fire station, or a parking structure can do double duty as both everyday infrastructure and emergency refuge. Communities sat down with maps and worked out where people actually are during the day and how far you could. Each of them could realistically travel in 10 minutes. Those reports are still online, and the concept drawings inside them are genuinely worth a look. The berm option in particular surprises people because it doesn't read as emergency infrastructure at all. It reads as a park, an engineered hill with a switchbacking path up the side, designed to look like ordinary landscaping until the one day it isn't. That early work eventually turned into a formal design manual. Washington now publishes a document called the Manual for Tsunami Vertical Evacuation Structures, currently in its 2nd edition. And it's the reference engineers actually use when designing one of these HINGs, because a tsunami refuge has to survive 2 disasters back to back. First, a magnitude 9 earthquake shakes it for roughly 5 minutes. Then, minutes later, a wall of water hits that same structure, carrying logs, boats, vehicles, and pieces of other buildings with it, and the structure has to remain standing through both events, with hundreds of people already up on the roof. That's a set of loads no ordinary building code even contemplates. A normal structural code asks about snow, wind, and seismic shaking. A tsunami refuge has to additionally be checked against hydrodynamic force, moving water pushing directly on a wall, buoyancy, water actively trying to lift the structure off its foundation, debris impact, a solid object arriving at speed, debris damming, where a raft of wreckage piles up against the collar, eminence and turns, what was a slender open frame into something closer to a solid wall. The flow now has to push through and scour, the current actively excavating the ground out from underneath the foundation. While all of this is happening, the manual keeps getting revised because the field keeps learning. A great deal of what engineers now understand about how buildings actually behave in a tsunami came from surveying what survived and what didn't in Indonesia in 2004 and in Japan in 2011, and that knowledge has arrived steadily over time rather than all at once. That brings us to the first one ever built. Ocosta Elementary School sits in Westport, in Grays Harbor County, and in 2016 it became the first vertical evacuation structure in North America. The refuge itself is the roof of the school gymnasium, rated for more than 1,000 people. The platform sits at roughly 55 feet above sea level, about 28 feet above the ground it stands on, with ramps and stairways running up the outside, so nobody has to enter the building itself to reach the top. The engineering underneath is where it gets genuinely interesting. The foundation uses drilled piles driven around 50 feet down, past the soil layers expected to liquefy during a long earthquake, and deep enough that scour doesn't undermine the foundation either. The main stair towers are reinforced concrete. The columns on the seaward face are encased in concrete specifically so that debris impact, a shipping container or a log moving at 30 miles an hour, hits something able to absorb that force. The whole structure was designed using performance-based methods, meaning the engineers modeled specific hazard scenarios and checked the structure directly against them rather than simply applying a building code written for ordinary weather. The University of Washington's tsunami modeling group worked directly with the design team on the wave loads themselves. But the part of the Ocosta story that actually matters most here isn't the engineering, it's the vote that got it built. The old school buildings there were nearly a century old and sitting directly inside the inundation zone. Replacing them meant a school bond, and a school bond in Washington needs a supermajority to pass. The E District put the measure on the ballot, and it failed. They put it up again, and it failed again. Then, in April of 2013, they went back a third time. The bond was for $13.8 million. It passed with 69.78% of the vote. A small coastal school district, twice told no, went back a third time to ask its neighbors to tax themselves to build a roof their own children might one day have to stand on, and got a supermajority. The second built structure is a different kind of story entirely. The Shoalwater Bay Indian tribe lives at Tokeland in Pacific County on land that sits almost entirely inside the inundation zone. The tribe spent years working toward a TIASTIP, tsunami refuge, and on August 5, 2022, they dedicated the first freestanding tsunami evacuation tower in North America. It stands 50 feet tall, with 2 decks, one at 40 feet and one at 50, and support piers running 55 feet below ground. It's rated for more than 400 people, meaningfully more than the tribal population itself. The tribe made it explicitly open to anyone in the area during a disaster, visitor or resident alike. The funding came together in pieces, the way most of these projects do. The tribe contributed $1.2 million of its own money, and FEMA provided more than $3 million more. The timing at Tokeland is tighter in one respect and looser in another compared to Westport. Modeling suggests the community can reach the tower in 15 to 20 minutes on foot, while waves may take around 35 minutes to arrive there. That's a real margin, small, but real, and it exists only because the town itself sits so close to the tower. At the dedication, Chairwoman Charlene Nelson said something worth remembering, that the same approach could work in any community, and that working together makes a genuine difference. Lee Shipman, who worked on the project, put it even more directly, saying the tower helped shift the tribe from being helpless victims into people who know they can survive by working together. A tribal member named Lynn Clark said simply that the tower will save their lives someday. Robert Ezell, who directs the state's Emergency Management Division, said at the same dedication that the state intended to build more of these up and down the tsunami hazard zone. 4 years on, here's where that promise actually stands today. The third structure is currently under construction, and it's the first purpose-built public tower in Washington that isn't attached to either a school or a tribe. It's going into the Marina District in Westport. Construction cost runs around $11.4 million, with the bulk of that coming from a $16.7 million FEMA GINUGJU grant awarded in November of 2023 under a program then called Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. Capacity is rated at 2,000 people. Design work began back in 2020 following an earlier planning grant in 2018. The county held a public open house on the design in late May of this year with construction schedule. To begin in early August 2026 and a completion date targeted for August 31st, 2027. Hannah Cleverly, Deputy Director of Grays Harbor County Emergency Management, described what the marina site actually does in plain terms. Having a site down in the Marina District gives people a fighting chance to survive when the large Cascadia rupture eventually occurs. A fighting chance. That's careful language, chosen carefully, because the honest alternative on that spit right now is nothing at all. The federal funding for that project hit delays and was released in stages, which is worth flagging because it tells you something about the pace of this work generally. Ocean Shores has also received federal funding toward a possible future structure of its own. Look at how the 3 existing or in-progress projects were actually paid for, and you get 3 different answers. Ocosta came from a local school bond, meaning AF if U-1,000 coastal residents taxed themselves directly. Shoalwater Bay came from tribal funds plus a federal grant. Westport is overwhelmingly a competitive federal award that took roughly 5 years to move from initial planning grant to actual groundbreaking. There is NISING, a standing program that simply builds these as a matter of course. Every single one is assembled from scratch by a small local government with a handful of staff, competing against every other hazard mitigation project in the country for the same limited pool of federal money, which is part of why a hazard the state has fully mapped and fully costed out still only gets addressed at roughly 1 structure every 3 years. The county-by-county table is really the whole argument condensed onto one screen. Pacific County alone needs somewhere between 25 and 40 structures. Grays Harbor County needs 30 to 42. Clallam County needs somewhere between 1 and 3. Add all of that together, and you get the statewide figure mentioned at the start, at least 58 and potentially more than 80 structures needed in total. At the current pace of roughly 1 structure every 3 years, and at a cost of $11 to $14 million each, the math on actually finishing the job runs into centuries of time and billions of dollars. That's the honest scale of it, and nobody involved in this work claims otherwise he. But the state is doing something, which is more than most places facing this exact hazard can say, and it's doing it at a fraction of the speed the hazard itself would justify if money and time were unlimited. Both of those things are true simultaneously. So that's Washington. Now cross the Columbia River because Oregon faces the exact same subduction zone, the exact same fault, the exact same wave, and in many places the same low-lying coastal geography. In 1995, the Oregon legislature passed Senate Bill 379, which did something no other West Coast state had ever done. 1. It banned the construction of new essential facilities inside the tsunami inundation zone entirely, meaning schools, hospitals, jails, and police and fire stations. The buildings people would vitally need immediately after a disaster, and the buildings full of people who can't necessarily evacuate themselves quickly. Those facilities were prohibited from being built anywhere the water was expected to reach. Scientists who studied the fault objected publicly and directly to any weakening of that rule. Their position was straightforward. The buildings covered by the ban are precisely the buildings that shouldn't be sitting in the inundation zone in the first place. Removing the prohibition simply puts more people in the path of the water. For context on how unusual either state's position actually is, California never had a comparable ban on this kind of construction at all, which makes Oregon's original 1995 law genuinely unusual by West Coast standards, and its later repeal all the more significant. That's the shape of the last decade along this coast. One state has been slowly and expensively building places for people to climb. The other removed the rule that kept its own schools out of the water. Both decisions came from elected officials responding to what their constituents told them mattered at the time, and the fault line underneath both states, dough. Not distinguished between either political choice. It's worth saying clearly that Oregon hasn't stopped working on tsunami safety altogether. The state's Geology agency still maintains detailed evacuation mapping, and coastal communities still run regular drills. The repeal removed a prohibition rather than an entire preparedness program. But what it did remove was specifically the one rule that operated on the timescale a subduction earthquake actually runs on. A drill helps the people who happen to be there this particular year. A building lasts 50 to 100 years, and deciding where to put one is a decision that affects people who haven't even been born yet. It's worth spending a little more time on where the engineering knowledge behind these structures actually came from, because it wasn't developed in a lab in the Pacific Northwest. It came from studying disasters that already happened elsewhere. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, engineers surveyed which build. Ings in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand survived direct wave impact, and which ones failed and found a consistent pattern. Open ground floors that let water pass through without resistance tended to survive, while solid walls at ground level tended to fail, catastrophically, because they gave the wave something to push against rather than something to flow beneath. That single observation reshaped how coastal structures are now designed almost everywhere. Tsunamis are a real risk, favoring open, pile-supported ground levels specifically, so the water has somewhere to go. After the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in Japan, engineers got an even more detailed data set because Japan already had extensive tsunami infrastructure in place before that event, which meant researchers could directly compare structure. In this that were overwhelmed against structures that held, often standing right next to each other in the same devastated town. That comparison is where a lot of the specific guidance on debris, damming, and scour actually came from, since Japan's coastline was littered with exactly the kind of wreckage, boats, vehicle, entire houses that piles up against columns and turns an open structure into an effective wall. Every one of the design principles used at Ocosta, Tokeland, and now Westport traces back to lessons paid for, in the most literal sense, by these two earlier disasters on the other side of the Pacific. It's also worth understanding why the funding mechanism itself is such a persistent bottleneck, because it's not simply a matter of the state moving slowly out of indifference. Hazard mitigation money in the United States is generally awarded through competitive federal grant programs. Meaning a proposal for a tsunami tower in Westport is competing directly against wildfire mitigation projects in California, flood levee projects in the Midwest, and hurricane resilience projects along the Gulf Coast, all drawing from the same limited annual pool of federal funding. There's no dedicated national tsunami tower program that simply funds every qualifying project on a list. Each community has to independently write its own grant application, demonstrate its own cost-benefit case, and wait its turn in a national queue that has no particular obligation to prioritize the Washington coast over any other hazard anywhere else in the country. That's part of why the timeline from an initial planning grant to an actual completed structure has consistently run somewhere around 5 years, even when everything goes reasonably smoothly, and why a small county emergency management office with only a handful of staff ends up carrying the entire administrative burden of assembling these applications on top of its normal day-to-day responsibilities. There's also a psychological dimension to all of this that's easy to overlook when you're just looking at engineering drawings and funding tables. For a lot of longtime coastal residents, the fault itself has never actually moved in their lifetime, and it's genuinely difficult to sustain urgency around a hazard whose worst-case versi on is, by definition, something nobody currently alive has personally witnessed. That's part of why the Ocosta bond took 3 attempts to pass, not because residents didn't understand the risk intellectually, but because asking a community to tax itself for a disaster with no living memory attached to it is a genuinely hard sell, even when the underlying science is solid. The eventual supermajority the bond received suggests that persistent, patient communication eventually did the work that a single ballot measure alone couldn't. And that's a pattern worth remembering for any other coastal community still working through this same process today. It's worth being honest, too, about what these structures cannot do, beyond the caveats already mentioned about capacity and aftermath. None of them address the people who are simply too far from any structure to reach it in time, and no amount of additional towers fully solves that problem for every single resident and visitor along hundreds of miles of coastline. Some communities are geographically positioned such that even a generously funded tower program would still leave meaningful gaps, simply because the distances involved exceed what anyone can cover on foot in the available window, regardless of how many structures eventually get built. That's not a reason to stop building them, since a partial solution that saves thousands of lives is still a genuine achievement, but it is a reason to be honest about the limits of what vertical evacuation infrastructure alone can accomplish for a coastal line this long and this exposed. It's worth being careful about a few things a tower can't promise. A vertical evacuation structure does one specific job. You climb it, you survive the tsunami wave itself, but then you're standing on a platform in a wrecked landscape, waiting for help that could take days to arrive, possibly in February, possibly in the rain, with nothing beyond whatever you happen to be carrying when you climbed the stairs. Capacity figures are also engineering estimates, built on the assumption that people arrive in an orderly way and stand close together. Reported capacities can vary depending on who's quoting them, and in a real event, the number that actually matters is how many people can physically reach the structure in time, which is usually smaller than the platform's rated maximum. There's also an unsolved question underneath all of this. Every one of these struck to, represents a decision about who gets covered. Building a tower in the Marina District gives the Marina District a chance. It doesn't help anyone 3 miles up the road. Every siting choice draws a line on a map, and people live on both sides of that line. So here's the practical version of all of this for you specifically. The single most useful thing you can do if you live on or visit this coast is find out whether you're inside the inundation zone at all. Washington's Department of Natural Resources publishes tsunami hazard and evacuation mapping, and the state's emergency management EDT division hosts the walk time modeling directly. Oregon's Department of Geology and Mineral Industries publishes the equivalent maps for its own side of the river. These are public, free, and worth checking, regardless of how often you actually visit. The second thing, and this is the one almost nobody actually does, is time your own walk. Take the evacuation route from your house, your workplace, or your kid's school, and walk it, not drive it. at the pace you'd realistically manage if you were frightened and the road surface was broken up beneath you. If it takes you 50 minutes, you now know something genuinely important about your own situation that no map alone was ever going to tell you. Third, if there's a vertical evacuation stro, keep sure near you. Go look at it in daylight. Know which stairway you'd use well enough that you don't have to think about it in the moment. And fourth, work out the version of your plan that assumes you're not at home when it happens, since most emergency planning gets built around a kitchen or a garage, while most tsunami deaths on a coast like this one happen to people who were at work, at school, at the beach, or simply driving through. Each of those situations needs its own separate answer to the exact same question. From this specific spot, on foot, where do I go, and how long does it actually take me to get there? That question has a different answer at every single point on the map. And the only way to have it ready in an actual emergency is to have worked it out calmly beforehand, long before the ground ever starts to move. If you live anywhere along this particular stretch of coast, it's genuinely worth sharing with the people around you whether you actually know where your nearest high ground is, and roughly how long it takes to walk there. Not drive there, but actually walk there. It's a genuinely useful thing to know about your own situation, whether or not you ever end up needing it, and it costs nothing more than a single quiet afternoon of your time to find that out for certain, once and for all.